Stanford University.
Okay, good evening then, and welcome to session 3 of our exploration of everything to do with cars, past, present, and future. Each week we're going to take, as you'll appreciate, slightly different, sometimes considerably different angles, takes on things with respect to cars. And tonight we're going to move into something that's in some ways a little bit more speculative. We're going to be looking ahead, but ahead to really considering what the future might be for understanding the cultural history of cars. It's not that we don't have cultural histories that deal with cars. We do. I actually brought a few along that are sitting on our shelves in the lab, and we've got here Rudy Volti's Cars and Culture. This one, the car guys in the audience, the car people in the audience probably won't have come across, because it comes out of anthropology, the anthropology of material culture, car cultures. And then we have a big book called Autopia, Cars and Culture. And then one that's quite a favorite among the Revs crowd here, Paul Ingracia's Engines of Change, where he takes 15 cars and from his accounts, studies of 15 particular cars in American history over the last 100 years, he kind of hangs everything off them. So we do have cultural histories of the automobile, but we think things are changing, and that's one of the reasons why we have set up our Revs program. And tonight we're going to kind of explore some of the possible ways it might develop, given some of the things actually we've already explored. The proposition, it's hard to challenge really, that the automobile has been a key iconic component of the history of the West, and indeed the world, since the late 19th century. But how do we get our heads around that ubiquity? It's kind of everywhere. Anyway, tonight, joining us to take up this theme is an old colleague and friend of mine, Fred Turner, who's in the Department of Communication at Stanford. And this year took up he's director of Stanford's STS, Science, Technology, and Society program, and is pushing through, you're modernizing, I would say, in some ways.
We are fully reinvigorated.
There we go, invigorating the program, which has been a major feature of undergraduate life at Stanford for a while.
It is now the 4th largest major in the humanities and sciences at Stanford, bigger than history. Thank you very much.
And you know, as the title of the program suggests, Science, Technology, and Society, it's about precisely exploring the links that are the heart of our cars class. Fred is a cultural, can I call you a cultural historian, Fred?
In public? Yeah, you can, absolutely.
Do you have a way of describing yourself?
Yeah, so I would describe myself as a cultural historian who focuses especially on media technology, but more broadly on technology and cultural change. I'm really interested in how cultures believe one thing collectively at one moment, really with a great deal of conviction, and then 30 years later believe something quite different, often opposed. I'm very interested in the social mechanics by which that happens, and I'm very committed to thinking about technology in that process.
There we go, lovely. And we're going to explore our theme tonight in a slightly different way. We've had talks last week, the week before, followed by a little bit of conversation and then some questions. But tonight, what we're going to do is we've put together, I've taken some of Fred's slides and put some of mine along in with them. And they're meant to really just prompt, provoke some responses from me and Fred, but also you. And I've deliberately, because I'm getting to know the audience, put some slides in that I know will ring bells with you or prompt reactions from you. In fact, some of the slides I've put in require your contribution. And you'll see why. I'll leave it at that. So what we're going to do simply is just talk our way through a deck of slides. And you are more than welcome to interrupt and respond to what you're going to see on the screen. So we're exploring then what a cultural history of cars could look like. But it's not going to be a complete picture. I think here, as we might consider ourselves to be at the end, if you like, of the age of the internal combustion engine. And as Joe was sharing with us last week, we can see all sorts of new kind of futures coming along. But I think this is an interesting moment, which is prompting precisely a reevaluation of how we do get our heads around the history of the automobile. And I think, and Fred I know agrees, it's going to look a bit different. So we're kind of anticipating that, but not in a comprehensive, complete way. It's not that our deck of slides here, our themes, are going to sketch out, a plan for cultural, for research into the cultural history of cars. It's meant, again, as I say, to be a little bit more kind of provocative, suggestive, asking for your input, for a response. Okay, that's enough as an intro. Let's
jump in.
Jump in.
Great.
So here we go.
Oh, great. Shall I jump in?
Go for it, Fred, yes.
Okay, so Michael and I have worked together in the past, and one of the things that I love about working with Michael is that he, it's funny to talk about you in the third person as if you weren't here, gets the intersection of technology and meaning. And one of the things that's most challenging about doing cultural history around cars, if you're a cultural historian, is that cars in the academy have a very low status. This may not be news to some of you, will be news to others perhaps. But cars are plebeian, they're ordinary, they're part of everyday life. There's something that strange guys work on in garages and they get all oily, and that's not what we do in the academy. In the academy, when it comes to cultural history particularly, we tend to study, or have tended to study, and I think this is changing, and I'm hoping it's changing, and I'm working on changing it, but we have tended to study high cultural productions. Art, painting. When you said you were a cultural historian 50 years ago, what you meant was that you were somebody who studied painting, writing, the ideas of already famous people, usually men. That's got to change because technology is absolutely at the heart of cultural change, and cars are very much part of that. To give you both an inkling of where cars are a part of the existing cultural history and how we might get at this, even in an environment that remains intellectually conservative with regard to technology, which it does, perhaps least so at Stanford, but quite a bit so at other elite institutions. Let's have a look at these two images. So here's Giacomo Balla's abstract Speed and Passing Car, 1913. He was a futurist painter. The futurists in Italy, many of you will know, believed in making the beauty of the industrial world visible to everyone. They thought the new power of speed available through automobiles was simply extraordinary, something that literally was not on the earth 40 years before. And they wanted to come up with a visual language for that. And you can see the visual language here is almost cubist. It's very fragmented, it's very patterned. They saw that as almost an industrial mechanical style. They wanted to make the beauty of things mechanical visible to us. Fair enough. Okay. Over here we have Jacques-Henri Lartigue. I'm going to bring these back together in a moment. Jacques-Henri Lartigue was about 13, I think, when he took that picture. He took almost all of his pictures when he was a child, growing up in France. He was a wealthy child growing up in France. He had a camera. Utterly lovely man. Hysterical fun pictures. What I love about that picture and about many of the images connected with the REVS program here at Stanford is that it's a picture of a race. And many of these races early on, late 19th, early 20th century, took place in areas where people had not seen automobiles before. So there are images of people actually encountering an automobile for the very first time. And the looks are wonderful. And people trying to hold back their shock and surprise. Really delightful. But here, too, you see a distinct emphasis on speed. With the automobile leaving the image, the great rush and flow across the screen. Very powerful, powerful image. So how would you go after this if you were trying to do a cultural history? Well, a traditional approach would privilege the images. It would say, okay, cultural history studies painting, studies photography. So the question would be something like, how have automobiles and the experience of automobility shaped the way we see in painting and photography? And so that would be one kind of question. But let me throw. May I?
Oh, keep going.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but let me throw it out otherwise. Since quite literally, Michael, me, and some other folks are actually trying to develop these things. Take it the other way. If we take this the other way, if we start with these images, in order to ask questions about cars, and about their integration into everyday social life. What questions might we ask growing out of these images? Yeah, go for it.
How is photography shaped by the car? I mean, if you're trying to take a picture of something that's never gone that fast before, you get it halfway out of the frame and
okay.
the old blur.
So that's great. How is photography? Are you taking notes?
Yep.
Great, thanks. How? You may end up in a research agenda soon. You just have no idea. So, but how is photography shaped by the car? I love that, and I love the way that you framed it, because you're not asking how is the image shaped, but rather how are the practices of taking pictures and the technology with which we take pictures changed. And what you've got your hand on there is something that people in cultural history, as conventionally done, and I'm going to bash cultural historians a lot, even though I am one tonight, we're in the history building, you've got your finger right on this point where technology meets technology, and that's one of the ways cultures change. We see that all over the contemporary world. Algorithm meets algorithm, and suddenly we have a new process. That process meets process is really, really important, and that's very much the kind of question we might want to ask here. Terrific, thanks. Yeah?
I was going to comment that picture immediately says speed.
Uh-huh.
And so going into that image, how does speed affect the people that are observing it?
Great. So how does speed affect the people that are observing it? Great. And what I think is really interesting about that is something I try to think about with regard to these kinds of images is when we think about the effect of technology on people, one thing that we know from other kinds of technologies is that people bring their existing schemas to the encounter with the new thing, and they try to make sense of it in light of language they have or ideas they have from the old thing. And you can see that really well in aesthetics. So here you see the futurists trying to make sense of their experience of speed with a visual rhetoric that's coming from inside painting from other places. Cubism mostly. Yeah?
I remember one time reading that Queen Victoria was on a train that went up to 35 miles an hour, and it was too much for her, and she asked them to please slow it down.
Yeah, yeah.
And so if we think of Queen Victoria's apogee was 35 miles an hour, and what is his a few years later, how did that gap of speed acceleration affect society?
I think it's a critical question. And let me also just note, you've pointed to another issue which I think is critical and never talked about in these areas, which is the issue of newness. So there's been such a pushback in the academy against the idea that technologies determine things, technological determinism, that it's become very difficult to talk about things like, wow, radical newness with speed at a moment. You know, people are born and then a new technology appears and life is totally different. I've now had the experience of living through that with regard to the internet. I was born well before the internet. I wrote my papers on typewriters. I now teach the social impact of the internet. It's a different universe. My grandmother, whom I adored, grew up in rural Texas. The only sound she heard in her house when she grew up was the grass blowing outside. By the time,
Not a telephone?
no, not a telephone. She was born in the 19th century in rural Texas, so no telephones, no. No, but by the time she died, we had telephones, we had cars, we had planes, the whole on show. And that experience of newness alone is an important one, I think. Yeah?
For me, the photograph evokes a lot of emotion because as I look at the car, I'm a little scared because for me, he's going so fast that the people seem to be blowing. Right. And I'm afraid that the tire will blow out.
The tire will blow up?
Yes.
Oh, it's wonderful. And I think there's something else embedded in your comment that I want to pull out, which is the real difference between the people standing on the side and the people in the car. You know, I would argue that to an audience at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the people on the left would be recognizably people. That is to say, whole, self-standing, individuated beings. The people in the cars were some new thing. Different art movements called them different things. They might call them the new man. They were melded somehow into the body of the machine. You can't even see their whole selves. They're so in the machine. They're almost cyborg-like. That melding of body and machine is quite new in this moment.
It's the knight and his squire.
It's the knight and his squire. Yeah, I like that. That's very nice. That's very nice. I'm going to keep moving to folks I haven't heard from yet, and I'll come back to other folks. I've been missing this side of the room out of my left eye. Were there hands here? I just didn't see hands. Okay. So
let me throw in something
go.
about the futurist stuff here, because one of the things we were talking about, it might have been with John a couple of weeks ago, when certainly we were looking at motorsports and speed, and taking things absolutely to the limit. And we, John was taking us through the kind of epic character of motorsports in the 20th century, and indeed the almost into the sublime, absolute edges. And that absolutely is something I think that you can see in the, well, not just the picture, the futurist painting, but certainly in the movement, which was, it's not just speed, it's speed limits. And then with the limits of humankind being taken to excess and beyond.
Way beyond.
Which is very much, a futurist manifesto on, technology in the 20th century. And I think these kind of connections, this embeddedness, it's not just an experience of speed.
Right.
It's so much more that gets wrapped up in it all.
Yep. And I think you've got your finger on it. I saw John, your name is John?
Yes.
Just that John pointed out that I think is, what's John? No, actually, I'm sorry, it's the man behind John. I'm sorry. The connection between different technologies at the same moment. The car is not emerging in a vacuum. The car is emerging alongside the widespread industrialization of lots of different activities. Bicycles have emerged about 40 years earlier, and were considered very radical in their own time. Say again? Trains, exactly, middle of the 19th century, or actually earlier other places. But yeah. So speed and the extension of limits is a powerful theme across a lot of life in this period.
And one of the wonderful things about the photo, the Latigue, is, of course, that you shouldn't frame a car like that. As you said, it's off the edge, which of course communicates the speed. But literally, it's gone beyond the limit.
Right.
But what I would really like, and this is going to crop up later in some other slides, is this, okay, we think that speed, we've got the title here, and vision, or the image, so we've got two images here. And that's fair enough. However, your proposition, I think it's absolutely right, Fred, is to say, when technology meets technology, photography meets the car, it kind of prompts you to say, let's not look at this as a photograph, but as a meeting of two technologies. Now, what is that?
That's really nice.
On the one hand, the photo is precisely your 13-year-old Latigue, who's got the machine and is responding to the car going by, takes a photo. But actually, it's the response he makes to the photo that we get in that. So it's the image, yes, but it's also how a camera helps you engage with the experience of looking at a speeding car. And I think what we're looking there for is technologies, how they connect you to your world and experiences and such. And it may take a visual expression, but isn't necessarily about the visual.
Right. So this is, yes, go for it.
Metaphorically looking at that,
Yeah.
the people are kind of leaning into the past, and the car is going into the future.
Yeah, isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful? I love it. I love it.
The shape of the wheel really pushes us into the future.
And you've got your finger right there on how the automobile becomes the symbol, the emblem of a whole new era. And that's really powerful. I want to throw out some analytical categories that we use in science technology studies for thinking about culture in regard to machines, because I think they're useful. They're real straightforward, but I think they're useful. The first category I want to throw out is practice. Practice is just really literally stuff you do. It's nothing. It's a fancy word for just what we do. But as we think about the impact of speed on daily life, one of the things that I think we need to start asking about is practice. What practices change because we have things going really fast, either around us, under us, with us? The second is representation. So representation is just a fancy word for images, usually photographs and paintings, but other things as well. So when we think about speed and vision, what we're thinking about is a shift in two dimensions at the same time. One shift is in practices of photography, which may be mediated themselves by machines. And the machines may have their own practices that are almost semi-independent from us. And then the other shift is in representation. So when we talk about seeing, I want to break down seeing and take it sort of out of our eyes and put it into our screens and into the things that we do with cameras, our practices, and our representations.
I think there's something about representation I think is good. When you think of what representatives do, the practice, they speak for, they stand in as in a political representative. They stand in for, supposedly, a community. That's the ideal. And I think this notion of stand-ins, the car standing in for something else, an image standing in for something else, and certainly with the futurists, they were constantly looking for ways of expressing, yes, finding stand-ins, representations of what they saw as crucial key components of cultural, political, social, technological change in their times.
The last thing I want to add to this discussion on this slide is another word that I think is incredibly important and often left out of cultural history and technological history, and that is legitimacy. One of the things that paintings and photographs of technologies do is they render them culturally legitimate. Things come into being, automobiles, computers even more dramatically. I know the computer history better. And they come into being and people don't always know what to do with them. They have a very wide range of capacities. How do you select which capacities to use? How do you select which capacities to celebrate? My favorite example of this is when the Mac came on, the very first Mac, Mac 1. The folks down at Apple were trying to figure out how this thing could be used. And they pitched it very hard as an electronic recipe book. You laugh now, but like there were whole ad campaigns devoted to convincing people to have a $2,000 recipe book in their kitchen. You know, can you just imagine cooking with olive oil next to your computer? You know, no. Some of you are going, yeah, sure. You know, scary crowd. But in any event, my point is that one of the ways to study the cultural history of an automobile would be to study the ways in which different cultural actors render the automobile legitimate or illegitimate. And it's an interesting question. One of the things that art does for automobiles is it renders it, and this is an explicit part of the futurist agenda, was to render the industrial experience legitimate for all classes, for everyone to think about and see.
I like this way, though, that we start with speed, which is where we've been before, and see where it takes you. And that precisely, I think, is what we can see cultural history doing with us. A classic, of course, component of the cultural history of the automobile in the 20th century is, the road story, the stories of the road, in novels and all sorts. Fred.
So I'm going to tell this a little bit sideways. My first intellectual affection was for the American Puritans. I've always wanted to confess that in public, so I'm going to take it there. Okay. The American Puritans, famous for Cotton Mather, but in their time, a people that came to the shores of New England, which is where I'm from, with the notion that God would be watching them while they built an alternative and better world. They built a world that could be alternative to fallen, corrupt Europe and made it better. And gradually they began migrating inland. The story of the road for the Puritans was the story of Exodus from the Bible. They thought they had been sent away. They were the new Israelites, and they would come to America and become a new and better people. That myth, that story, has hovered underneath American film, literature, iconography for 300 years now. And what's intriguing about the road, the actual physical road, and the automobiles that traverse it from a mythological point of view, in my view, in an American context, is the ways in which the earlier Puritan schemas of escaping the old broken land, moving somewhere to build the new one with a chosen people, have gotten attached to our highway infrastructure. Now, if I say highway infrastructure, at least in certain circles, people automatically kind of go. But if I say the road, people go, yeah, Jack Kerouac, on the road, hobos, the road. I mean, how many people have written songs about highway infrastructure? Yeah, right. You see my point, right? Woody Guthrie wasn't singing, oh, glorious infrastructure. Singing about the road. What's intriguing from a cultural historical perspective is you see in stories of the road a negotiation, a deep cultural negotiation between core American myths and emerging technologies, roads and automobiles. And one of the things that intrigues me most is the way that different communities deal with these stories. So I do a lot of this kind of work with computers, and I'll talk to computer scientists, computer engineers, and they'll say, oh, Fred, that's just hogwash. We don't think about myths in the lab. We just want to make it work. And I'm like, yeah, well, first off, I'm like, yes, you do, absolutely. And then so I say to them, well, what do you read? Oh, I read all this good sci-fi. I'm like, yeah. So I'm very interested in the places where the myth and the machine get attached. And narrative, storytelling, is one of the places where that happens most aggressively. And in this case, the road is one of the very deepest symbolic formations we have in the United States. It goes all the way back to the Puritans. The road is where we make our changes. The road is where we become ourselves. Even when foreign photographers, in this case, the Swiss photographer Robert Frank in about 1954, come to the United States, they want to take pictures of the road. Of the road. How many German tourists do you know who have gone to Route 66 first? Okay, there's a reason. The road has become a kind of epic, symbolic space. Okay, now, please jump in if you have questions. I can ramble a bit, but I want to talk about a flip side, the flip side of myth. The flip side of myth and narrative is that myth and narrative often live in worlds that are disembodied. They live in words. They live in books, modestly embodied. They live in stories. They live in ideas. They float. The challenge with the floating myth is that it can sometimes impede your encounter with the actual thing. It becomes hard to think highway infrastructure because you're so busy thinking the road. You know, I mean, if I say Eisenhower to you, you're going to think the bald-headed president probably. You're not going to think Eisenhower, the completion of the highway system. Okay? If I say car to you in the 1950s, you may, as we'll see in a moment, you may think back to being a teenager in the 1950s, independence. You're not stepping back to think, wow, military-industrial production of a highway system to keep the populace safe in the event of nuclear attack helps make it possible for me to neck in the back of the car. Those kinds of chains of association disappear. See, it's just you and me. Nobody else has ever done that, right? You know? Yeah. It's all like front seat people out there. Yeah, right. It's a bucket seat crowd out here. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm glad somebody's laughing. You guys are tough, man. You guys are really tough. So what I want to say about myth is that myth can cut into our ability to appreciate fact. And that's a challenge. It organizes things, but it filters things out. And so as we look at places where myth and machine encounter one another, we need to step back and ask, what's getting filtered in, what's getting filtered out of the story, and why?
There's we're going to be returning to story telling constantly, and there's a distinction I like to make here, which picks up on what you're saying about myth, Fred. And you know, myth. The narrative forms of myth can give structure, meaning, significance to experience. Okay, but the structures, as you rightly said, can, you know, sort of prevent us seeing alternatives. They close things down because they're neat, they're formulaic, and they work. They're nice. They're very comforting often, and they do. They make sense of the world. And the forms of narrative that the components of narrative include all the stuff that we're very familiar with: plot, emplotment, making plots out of things, character, viewpoint. You can have flashbacks. You can change time around and such. And yeah, it's both meaning making, as you say, it can shut things down. There's a crucial distinction, I think, that comes out of as well some of the concepts that you just gave us before of representation, practice, and indeed legitimacy. Myths as legitimating, you know, the world and making sense of it for us. But if you think of how myths get mobilized, how they get used, the distinction then that I'm drawing is between narrative as structures for understanding the world and the mobilization of narrative in storytelling. Because telling stories can be quite different to the actual narratives that you may be drawing on, in the sense that you can change them or you can interrupt them. You can say, nah, it wasn't really like that, but you know what it's like on the road. So in telling, mobilizing a myth or a narrative, you can make it live again. And that's often what we all do. We are so appreciative of this world of narrative that comes with these iconic things like cars. We're very appreciative of it. We're very sensitive to them. And we mobilize them in all sorts of different ways in our telling of different personal, individual stories. And what I'm really wanting, and it's already happening, our Revs program to do, is to collect the stories as well as the myths.
Could I try an experiment?
Go for it.
So I'm willing to bet that every one of us has an iconic road story somewhere in us. Not a long one, okay?
Only one?
I'm a kind of bookish guy. Most of mine are inside, right? But I'm a library guy. What can I say? Think for a moment, if you would. If I say to you, on the road, what image pops into your head? Sentence or two, no more.
Short drive between LA and Chicago.
Okay, short drive between LA and Chicago.
Sure, I had one where my grandfather explained the nature of food in cars. So I was driving from Boston to California for the first time.
The nature
He
of
said we were about to embark on a great culinary wasteland, which will start to get to San Francisco. It was a very interesting story.
That's great, food, yeah.
I went from San Francisco to be sure it was awesome.
So I'm guessing by your accent that you weren't born here.
No.
Okay, so what was Highway 1 for you?
It was my parents this summer. It was an awesome trip. And I was beautiful. It was a fantastic share.
Okay.
Share with my parents at the time.
Okay.
On the coast.
Okay.
70 miles. And we stopped many times, 250 miles one day.
And was it like France?
No, France is different.
Uh-huh. How?
No, means there was nobody here. It was on Monday. I was impressed by the land and no tourists.
Okay.
You
were literally alone on the land, on the road, in the language of the Puritans, under the eye of God.
France is all the French coast are very, very beautiful.
Yeah, lots of nice. Well, we're not going to go to the wine thing yet. Good. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Chevy Impala, New York to California with the top down.
With the top down. Oh man, you're lucky you have any hair left. That's great. Dang. Oh, that's good. But that was the top down. Oh, okay, an Impala. I crave an Impala. Yes.
We were juniors in high school in Pali, and we drove down in the 80s to look at colleges in Southern California. And my friend's '67 Mustang Fastback, and it was just glorious all the way to 101.
Oh, 101. Oh, that is glorious. Yes. I'll come back to 6. Okay, yep.
38 hours, San Diego to Chicago, 6 college kids, only stop for gas.
Oh, that's great. Were you, if you don't mind my asking, were you sober? Yeah. Okay, great. I have a trip much like that from New Orleans to Chicago. Yeah.
62 Corvette, Long Island to Boston to go out on a date with a girl.
Long Island to Boston? Wow, she must have been some girl. Yeah, that's great. Did you keep her?
No.
Okay, just checking. All right, way corner.
Driving to Southern California in a car just like the one shown in the picture.
Oh, wow. Great. Dynamite, thanks. Yeah.
Driving from Hammerfest, 300 miles inside the Arctic Circle, down to the Sahara Desert in an MGA twin cab. Top down.
Interesting, interesting. Sleeping on, wow, that's great, thank you.
Getting stopped by a cop while driving a '63 Studebaker Wagoneer with a BMW motorcycle chained to the roof.
Nothing says smuggler. Like, what, did he stop you because it was beautiful or because you were doing something bad?
It might not be safe.
He's got a point, yeah, thanks.
3 a.m. leaving from San Diego to here in a 95Z28 Camaro and making it in 5 hours.
Attaboy. That's great. That's great. So I hardly know which one to tell in my own case, but it's probably me and 2 friends who were working offshore in Louisiana. We saved up enough money to buy an old VW bus, put an engine in, and drove it to Chicago in one fell swoop. It was pretty spectacular, and we were not sober, but it was pretty great. I couldn't believe we did it. What I want to note about these stories, I don't know if you heard the pattern of the stories, but my inner sociologist was paying attention. I'd say we just heard probably 15 stories overall, of which somewhere between 3 and 5 were what we might think of as set at a small local scene, happening within a small radius of geography, involving a couple of people, me and my father, learning about food in the car, that kind of thing. The great majority of these stories were attached to either transformational moments in our lives, looking at colleges, pursuing an important relationship, or towards experiences of wide open raw speed and grandeur, American grandeur. And I'm intrigued by that because I've had the same experiences, and I'm wondering if we would get the same answers in, say, Thailand. I don't know. Yeah.
Also going at a very high speed if possible.
Going in very high speed.
The idea of moving is, like you said,
critical.
Making it in 5 hours or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
How fast we can get.
Yeah, and the sheer raw pleasure of transcending distance. It's like ham radio, but with your body, right? You can imagine cutting across massive amounts of distance. It feels great, yeah.
Well, one interesting thing is when you talk about the road trip, I mean, I remember I was 5 years old in the Philippines, and it was a Bel Air. And I was standing in the middle of the map.
Yeah.
But I also remember getting in, we went to Clark Airfield. I think my dad was getting off a plane or something.
Right.
So when you said it was a transformational moment, it was like, that was the first time I distinctly remembered, oh, this is the United States of America, and I am from the Philippines. So that was.
But that's really interesting. And I want to flag something that you're saying that's really important. It's about this practice representation distinction from earlier. In traditional literary study or traditional cultural history, it's symbols that matter. It's stories and symbols. So that, we tell a story, it has metaphors, it has symbols, that's important. When you bring technology into cultural history, what you start getting are not only symbols, but practices. So it wasn't just that you saw the Bel Air, it's getting into the Bel Air. It's feeling the Bel Air. It's smelling that funny new car smell. Putting your feeling the roll, the roll and tucked and rolled upholstery. It's all those things that aren't the Philippines. They're something else. One of the things historians live for is that kind of quiddity, that kind of thingness. Yeah.
1933, 1930 Hupmobile driving from Long Beach, California, which had just had the big earthquake, up to visit my aunt in Humboldt State County, and I can still feel the itchy upholstery.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was my first great road trip.
Dynamite. I just love it that we've all had road trips. Yeah, let's hear one more.
There's an interpersonal feature to it too.
Okay.
Because if you spend 3 days behind the windshield with someone, you become an instant family. The layers peel off, and you learn things that you probably don't even want to know about people.
Right.
So it's an instant family.
Yeah.
There's a psychological dynamic.
I think you're absolutely right, and I've ruminated on that a little bit, and I think it's the combination of the box of the car, which is quite small. Where else are you going to be in that contained a space with 4 or 5 people? I wouldn't let myself be in that contained a space in other kinds of places. Coupled with the view out the window, the rushing air, the sense of moving through outer space. It's a little bit like being in a space capsule. Yeah, actually, bada bing, yeah, that's good. Yeah. No, it's true, it's true. Well, that's where we come back to myth, right? Because the era of the road trip is also the era of NASA. And it's the era of exploring space. It's the era of shooting ourselves up into the air. And those things are not unrelated. Yes?
What's interesting is you use the term road trip. So I think maybe that's why road, you think of a long trip, an adventure. If you say, like, someone tells me I'm going to go for a drive, I think of, like, on twisty road and just like a short, fun drive, until you get sick and then you're done. Road implies if I'm going to hit the road is like long adventure.
Yeah.
And a lot of times even like the worst experiences at the time are the ones that we remember and think back on. And like, that was
You're exactly right. And what you've got your thumb on here is the pulse of myth. If we say go for a drive, right? It's like Ma and Pa Kettle on Sunday morning. No myth there. Just a couple of people looking for something to do. On the road, boom, you've just touched the beating heart of American mythology. We're going on something transformational. We're traveling. We're going to be somebody new. We're going to be new kinds of people together. We're going to form a new unity. We're going to be like John Winthrop said in 1633 aboard the Arbella. He said, we're going to be a city, on a hill. And the eyes of the world shall be upon us. All right, I'm pushing the Puritan thing kind of hard. But back to you, Michael.
Do you want to say?
Yes, please. Go ahead and CJ.
Go for it.
Go for it. Story so much, but my thought was, is the road story just sort of like the extension of just travel stories, which have been around? I mean, the Canterbury Tales is a travel story. I
want to say no. No, I want to say no to that quite emphatically. So, I think the intuition is exactly right. That there are travel stories, pilgrimage stories that are old and long, and they come to the U.S. With the Puritans, with the Pilgrims, in the early 17th, late 16th, depending on who you believe, period. So they have that heritage, but the American version really is different, I think. I think it's inflected by a kind of hyper-individualism, a Protestant ethos, a very particular history with regard to the landscape and how we imagine where God is in relation to the landscape historically. So there's a history. It's part of that longer history, but I want to argue as an Americanist that there's a strong break in the early 17th century, and that really inflects how we think about cars and now how we export our myths in the body of cars to other countries.
Let's move on.
Great.
This photo, I'll just give a quick.
Please do. Yeah,
the one of the car on the left here is from. It's enormous, isn't it? In Naples, the Collier Museum over in Naples, Florida, and it's an extraordinary picture, I think. But anyway, Fred.
So that's Geronimo with the headdress. Yeah. Okay, and that's Geronimo. I believe he's in a Model T. Is that right, car people? Model. What is that? It's a Cadillac?
Didn't he have a Cadillac?
I don't know the story. You tell me.
I thought he was in a Cadillac.
I think you might be right, actually.
Actually, the only reason I think of that is there was some song I remember from 30 years ago called Geronimo's Cadillac.
Oh, right. Of course, yeah.
Is Geronimo the one in the top hat or in the Indian headdress?
He's in the full headdress, I believe.
I thought he was.
Is he in the top hat? I don't know.
He was in the top
Let me see. I can't see close enough. Oh, sorry. Gosh, you may be right, actually. Look at that, because this is well after he's lost power.
Yeah, it was shortly before he died.
And they gave him a car, as I remember. I think what I wanted to bring in by means of these images was the dark side of the myth that we were talking about earlier with On the Road. Yeah. And it's the colonial side of things. On the one hand, as we take our road trips, we liberate ourselves to be ever more ourselves and to build new intimacies with the people in the cars with us. But we're not exactly always driving through empty land. And simply by driving, we're not always being kind to the land or its inhabitants. We have a small problem with fossil fuels on this planet right now. And this is one of the places it gets started. And so another way to think about the cultural history of the automobile, or let me put it a different way, another history in which it is entangled is the history of colonial expansion and the history of environmental degradation. And that is also part of this history. I have less to say about it. I think it's really important. I don't know what to do about it, but I'm aware of it every time I get in my car. Yeah?
I just wanted to say, I looked it up. It's called a Cadillac Locomobile Model C.
Cadillac Locomobile Model C, man, you're good. Dang. I need you in my digital media class. You are seriously good. Yeah, this is good. Now, getting the internet is good, but finding it on the internet's hard. 10 seconds. Man, this is a good crowd. All right. Look at this. You all got it. Maybe I'm just a little slow. Okay, Cadillac Locomobile. Anybody got the story on who's who in there? Who's who in the picture? Yeah.
So it's,
Joe?
I don't know if it's who's who. It's Poca City, Oklahoma. It's the Miller Brothers 101 Ranch. So Geronimo, I think, is driving. Geronimo's left is Edward Lee Sinclair Sr. He's a Ponca Indian. Geronimo, so my parents were big pest. Blah, 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 later.
Okay. So how would we locate this image? Imagine you come across this image in an archive, and you're told by your professor to make it evidence in some cultural history. What do you do with it? I mean, I had an experience like this. I went to the Collier Museum. I saw this thing hanging on the wall. I was like, I'd never seen it before. It's like, where do I start with this? So where do we start with something like this? What are the questions we can ask of this image?
Yeah, what are the Indians doing riding around with guys with top hats?
Even better, what are the Indians doing wearing top hats? Yeah, I think it's an Indian in a top hat. It's Geronimo in the top hat. Yeah.
Now we give them casinos.
Now we give them casinos. Dang. Oh, ouch. Yes.
Were they actually driving it, or did they just take the picture just for show?
Great question. Great question. And why would it be important to take a picture like this for show at that historical moment, do you think?
I think it's a symbol of the emasculation of the Indians in Geronimo. I mean, he was on a reservation. He'd been completely tamed. He'd become completely toothless. The government gave him this car basically to show, propaganda to show the world that these guys are no threat anymore. We've completely emasculated them. They've been basically bought out, acculturated, and become completely irrelevant. That's what that picture is about.
Okay, so I'm with you all the way on the symbolics. I'll even take it one step further. As you were talking, I was thinking, wow, we've actually got our finger on another pattern here. It's the pattern of the golden rice that we used to ship to Southeast Asia, or some of the GMOs that Monsanto creates now. We have a technology here that we give to show as a sign of progress. It's nominally, you know, here, Geronimo, join the Western world, modernize. But we also have an invitation and in many ways a requirement to engage with the systems that produce the technology. So cars demand roads. You know, you can't drive that car forever in those fields. Cars demand roads, cars demand gasoline. Roads and gasoline require industries to be made. Same way with GMOs, right? GMO, a genetically modified organism, depending on what kind. Corn, for example, you plant the corn, at the end of the season, you have to go out and buy more. You can't just keep growing. So where I'm going with this is that this is not only a symbolic emasculation, it's the beginning of a cultural dependency managed through a machine. And that's one of the things machines do. Pardon? Yeah. But if machines can be engines of changing large-scale cultural relations, it's important to figure out how they do that. Joe, yeah.
Well, for a couple of hundred years, people all over the world thought of the United States back in those days of cowboys and Indians. We exported that image. So people in Europe, people in Asia thought if you came to the United States, you'd see Indians on reservation or riding out on the plain on horses.
Right, right.
And then to see Indians in a car is very disconcerting to that image.
Yeah, it's true.
It destroys 200 years of images.
Well, so here's another topic that somebody ought to write a paper on. I don't know if you all are writing papers in the course, but boy, I'd like to see a paper on the Indian and the automobile. Anybody remember the Texaco Chief? You know? There's a lot of association here between the independence of Indians on the plains and the independence of riders in the car. Yeah. Pontiac. Yeah, exactly. Right. Pontiac. I mean, yeah. This.
Indian motorcycles too?
Yeah. Right. Wait. Was that who made Indians? Was it Harley or was it? It's Indian company. Okay. Exactly. That's interesting. That's interesting.
There's an Indian museum in Springfield, Massachusetts, run by a little old lady. You have to call in advance to go, but it really is worth
the motorcycle. You're talking about the motorcycle.
The
Motorcycle, great. But it's intriguing to me how symbols from different places get attached to artifacts, and the Indian is clearly one. Great. All right.
Now, we've done motorsports, but I know you've got I
have a peculiar take on it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have to tell this story a little backwards. I had a professor in graduate school. I'm a former journalist. Let me put it differently. I'm a reformed journalist who went to grad school after 10 years as a journalist. I went back in my mid-30s. One of the people I studied with was a woman who studies 17th century France. And she wrote a book on the gardens of Versailles. And all my friends kept coming up to me and saying, you've got to read this book on the gardens of Versailles. And I'm like, are you know, what? I'm interested in television and contemporary culture. Versailles? Nah. No, you got to read it, So finally I go and read it. And what she writes about is how the gardens of Versailles were, for the court of the Louis, a practice area for practicing miniature versions of military technology. So the diggers that they used, the dikes that they built, the dams, the park features were often military processes reduced and made symbolic in the garden space. Courtiers, in turn, began to wear the emblems of their military affiliation in terms of the garden. One of these is apparently the fleur-de-lis. Others are different flowers that have meaning based on the garden. I'm only reporting what she taught me. After I read that book, I could never look at a football field the same way again. The football field began to look to me like a practice space for certain kinds of behaviors, an emblem of certain ways of being. And I want to argue that one possible way to think about racetracks is like that. That racetracks, NASCAR, but also older racetracks, might be places to experiment with, practice, play with new ways of being in relations to machines and to one another, in relations to individuality and to crowds, that have not existed before.
There's a series on British TV, which we can get in the US currently, and it's an emotional history of the stiff upper lip. It's an emotional history of Britain. So it's about British...
Kind of a quiet thing, isn't it?
Cultural reserve. And where it comes from.
Yeah.
And Ian Hislop, who presents it, does a kind of exercise such as you've just been describing, Fred, where he shows how this cultural production of emotion took place, starting, apparently, late 18th century with the French Revolution, and a British reaction to what was going on in France. And yeah, and it's, oh my gosh, we can't go there. And we don't want to be anything like Napoleon and the court. We will go with Wellington, who had a very particular kind of reserved disposition, developed through the 19th century and such, through, precisely, places where you could act out and perform these ways of just deporting yourself, acting and behaving. And one of the things that has cropped up briefly in one of the shows is something that we were covering a little bit with John, which is, you know, we were hearing about Sterling Moss in our first session, and other racing experiences, which are this limits thing again, and the craziness of some of it. And one of the points that it just sparked up in my mind was that the 50s in Britain, where we had a Sterling Moss victory, were a time after the war where there was a kind of a pursuit or a celebration, indeed, of certain aspects of the British character that were captured, for example, in the ascent of Everest, of going and doing these things. So there are arenas where these achievements take place, and they're coming out of schooling, the military, or of your political experiences, or just your attitudes towards it's an emotional kind of landscape as well. Anyway.
I love the idea of a racetrack as an affective engine, an engine for the production of emotion in a society and a culture. I mean, it's a bread and circuses kind of argument, but it's interesting. I also like to think about racetracks as spaces for the centralization of some symbolic resources and the filtering out of others. Have a look at that racetrack. What do you not see on the automobiles? Contemporary race fans?
Roll bars?
Roll bars, okay. Oh, it's interesting. You guys are, fenders, fascinating. You guys are seeing the machines. I'm seeing something totally different. Pardon? Sponsorship. Right. I'm not, that was really interesting. Yeah, right. Oh, sorry, my bad. Yeah, so no, I'm not seeing sponsorship. I'm not seeing advertising. This is a pre-commercialized space in many ways. And that's, I mean, so if I pull back from the machines themselves for a moment and I say, what cultural values are being enacted here? What practices are here? What practices are not here? I see practices associated with individual, independent, almost hobbyist sportsmanship as distinct from the practice of sportsmanship that we would see now at NASCAR, which is highly commercialized, and the performance of individual valor within a highly commercial society. Very different kind of thing.
This is like the Olympics.
Much more like the Olympics. Much more like the Olympics, actually. Yeah, very much more like the Olympics. Probably within 30 years of when the Olympics movement really got going again. Yeah, great. Yeah.
Talking about schemas, this just looks like you just replaced your four-legged horse with a four-wheeled.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That is interesting. That's a good point. Yeah.
Well, it was the adage that those are all distinct makes of cars. And the idea was if you were successful on Sunday, you could sell a car on Monday.
Oh, that's very interesting. I had no idea. So
But just going along with that is a horse track. That's where they raced.
Exactly.
Oh, interesting.
It just happened like that. It was just.
That's really, really interesting. So would horses have continued to race on this space? Yes. Okay, so they go back and forth. Interesting. Yeah.
They didn't have Beach, the original Pebble Beach.
Oh, interesting. So I'm sorry.
First races at Pebble Beach were actually on the racetrack.
Oh, I had no idea. That's
Way
great.
back
Yeah.
when they were trying to get people to drive down there for a weekend, and they actually put cars on it.
Neat. Thanks. Yeah.
So I was just thinking, wouldn't back in the day the car itself be the propaganda for just the model of the car that they were driving?
You know, I don't know the answer. I think you actually were suggesting that they might sell the car.
That would be it back then, where it was just that's the model of the car and that's the car.
So if I'm understanding, you'd say, wow, the Ford won the race. We should all get Fords.
Exactly. Yeah. Instead of,
Is that the logic in the period? Yeah, that's interesting. That's really interesting. How would races have been promoted and the news be circulated? Is this a newspaper thing? Who would do that? I don't know.
The earliest international motor races were publicised by a newspaper baron called Gordon Bennett.
Oh, great.
So he would put on a big prize, and then it would be crazily, let's race from one city to another.
Oh, fabulous.
And damn any peasants or dogs that get in the way.
And would these be covered in real time by radio as well, or is it strictly a newspaper thing?
Those city-to-city races were late 19th century.
Oh, wow. Okay, very early. Very early, yeah.
As early as 1903, they were stopping those races because they were so dangerous. Because as you said, people had never seen cars before. So if you think people couldn't judge how to get out of the way because you'd never seen something moving at 60 miles an hour before.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Now I'll catch you in the back. Yeah.
I think John can elaborate on perhaps the Vanderbilt Cup races that were held in conjunction with World Fairs and things like that.
That's interesting. I don't know anything about them. That's fascinating. What are the Vanderbilt Cup races?
They were pre-war races that were held in conjunction with Mr. Vanderbilt. Was Vanderbilt?
Yeah, it's a similar kind of thing. I don't know when they started. When did they start? Were they? They were running right into the 30s.
The last one would have been just before World War II in New York.
But there was a very early Grand Prix in Los Angeles in 1903 or something like that. But that was closed course. But actually ran along Wilshire and then part of PCA.
This is great. So a question my old professor of the Gardens of Versailles might be asking is, okay, in these spaces, in the Cup, in the Grand Prix, what cultural resources are being gathered and what are not? What kinds of experience is being legitimated? What kinds of experience is not? And one kind of experience that's clearly being legitimated is machine-enabled independence, machine-enabled individuality. Another might be the commercial experience that you've outlined, which sort of representing the car and selling it. I'm just trying to sort of think with the scene. What would we be able to pull from it? You had a question in the way back.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm not sure that the distinction that there's no sponsorship is that valid. It's just a question of degree, because Stutz, for instance, the slogan, advertising slogan was the car that made good in a day, and that was based on taking a Stutz to Indy. And I don't think they won, but something like they came in third when they basically stopped car, taking the fenders off, and then that became the slogan.
Great, that's a great point. Thanks.
So
that's your argument as well.
The degree of sponsorship, I'm not sure what to use there.
Great, thanks.
Is there something being promoted here around maybe a more modern notion of performance?
Yeah.
Because it's limits, how does this perform? How well do these perform? And managing performance in the sense of getting more out of a vehicle or something.
That's a nice thought.
Because I don't know that there was the same notion of performance with respect to machinery, with respect in the 19th century. I don't know that. I don't know.
Good question. Don't know.
Good question. Let's move on, eh?
Yeah.
So I think it's just nice that we can, I think, with a cultural history, really look freshly at something which, has been so much part of the history of racing for so long, and we have a certain take on it. It's a little bit different. This photograph is extraordinary. Take us through it, Fred.
Oh, I love this picture so much. So this is a photograph by a photographer named O. Winston Link. And all O. Winston Link took pictures of were trains. But as you can see, he took pictures of trains in the most rich possible visual and cultural settings. He actually worked with the different train lines to light the trains, and the drivers would come through over and over until he got just the shot he wanted. He worked really closely with them to commemorate their work. I just think, well, I mean, let me not read it. Let's read this together. This artifact drops out of space, and you need to make sense of the culture that produced it. What do you know from this artifact?
They like machinery.
Okay, they like machinery. Absolutely. They like machinery. Absolutely. Good. What else?
Ritualistic assemblage.
Yeah, okay, they have a ritualistic assemblage. How do you know it's ritualistic?
Because they're grouped.
Great. Not only grouped, but really in rows, all gazing toward a screen. Absolutely great. So they're big on machine-enabled rituals of some kind. Great. What else do we know? Yeah.
It looks like kind of an impossible setting as well.
Uh-huh.
You've got a steam locomotive and an airplane.
Yeah.
I don't think those two exist at the same time so much.
It's a jet.
Well, sure they are. That's from an actual film.
Yeah.
That's from a film called Station.
Jets on the movie screen.
Yeah, the jets on the movie screen. So they can and do actually coexist historically.
Really, we still had steam-powered trains when we had airplanes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's unbelievable.
I'm not convinced, by the way. I'm not convinced that's steam, by the way. That may actually be.
Maybe coal.
It may be coal or oil fired. I can't tell, but yeah.
I mean, it's just interesting because of all the different technology that's shown in this picture, including like the power lines, the radio in the car, just the type of cars, and then you have a video screen up there. It's not really a video; it's just a projection, and just like all the different things that you would find in that time, including the locomotive.
Okay, so I want to go for it.
Just a point. It wouldn't matter whether it's coal or wood. It's a steam engine.
Oh, okay, fair point. Wouldn't matter if it's coal or wood, it's a steam engine. Fair point. One thing I'll say about O. Winston Link, so I don't actually know enough about the different technologies here to be able to make a claim that they were all co-present historically. I do know that the way that O. Winston Link worked was to actually work with real stuff in real time, granted that he would have the train guys go back and forth again and again. But he didn't have special trains made for his images, so I know that that was a working train at the time. Okay, so we have this agglomeration of technologies at this moment. What period are we in, do you think?
Early 50s.
They can spot the cars.
I love this, man.
This is great.
This is a freaky group. You know, it just is. I love this. I'm used to folks with that kind of expertise around computers, not with automobiles. So this is cool. Okay, so we're in the late 50s.
Early 50s.
Well, okay, you say early, they say late. I don't know. We're at 57. I'm here at 56, 57.
No, there isn't a 57 there.
Yes, there is.
Which one?
We're gonna let them geek out for a minute. I'm clueless, so I don't know.
It's the 50s.
It's the 50s. Okay. It's the 50s. Now imagine that you're an undergraduate here at Stanford in my media technology history class, and I give you this on an exam, and I say, tell me everything you know about the 50s based on this document. What claims can you make about the 50s? We've got a couple on the table. That was machine related. It was ritualistic. What else do we know?
American made.
Very much American made, absolutely. So you can tell, at least if you know the brands of the cars at all, you'll know they're all American made. There are no Toyotas in that batch. Nobody's necking in a Honda Civic. Okay.
No bucket seats either.
Yeah, I know. Bucket seats were such a curse. I was a teenager when they came into being, and it was just the pits. Yeah.
They're very hard to incorporate technology into their society as well.
Clearly, they're trying to do that. So, what makes you say that?
It's because of how close everything is together and how much technology there is in this one picture. And before that, there wasn't so much of that.
Okay, so let's compare this image to the earlier Lartigue image that we saw. Remember Lartigue? Lartigue was all about speed, and your point that was so astute was that the people in the back, yeah, exactly, I would just do my hands. Yeah, there was the futurists going forward, and the other regular folks fading into history. What are people doing in this picture?
The future is now.
The future is now, man, and we're gonna, you know.
Yeah, but they're all looking at the screen.
Yeah,
to see the screen.
but this is what's so intriguing. In the Lartigue image, we have images of people standing freely, alone, independent individuals, freestanding, almost like 19th century character people. Here, we have people being incredibly intimate with each other in a world that is already completely inflected by technology and media. It's almost as if there is no intimacy separate from the machine world.
But also, you know, convertible. A convertible, whereas the other cars don't seem to be convertible. Maybe he had to do it that way in order to show the couple together.
Right, but where I'm trying to go with, I agree with you, but where I'm trying to go with this is, it's interesting to me that that's a couple. It's not mom, pa, kettle. That's not old people in there. That's not guys our age, you know, my age, yeah, right.
I was going to say in the first one, it actually, like, how they took the picture and how the people are looking at the car, it looks like this is new, no one's seen this before, this is exciting. Here, this looks like this is normal and it's awesome, as opposed to it's new.
Right, right. It's normal and it's awesome. That's the second feature that's important here. Cars are routinely associated with grandeur. Something that David Nye, a historian, once called the technological sublime. And I love that phrase, the technological sublime. You know, this is an example in some ways of the technological sublime rendered ordinary, rendered banal, part of daily life.
Yeah, there's the daily life, but my goodness, the way it's all crammed in there.
Right.
You know, and the proximity, there's a crampedness to it.
Yep.
It's,
so what we're doing here
dense.
is actually a really traditional exercise in cultural history. And it's one that works well for some things but gets in the way of others. The exercise is take an image and read it for its contents, and through the contents, understand the values of the culture that the image depicts. That's a really traditional way of doing cultural history around images. And with this image, knowing that it's the 50s, I can see a highly militarized, that's an American jet fighter, highly technological, highly mobile, highly individuated society in which the generations are quite separate. Even teenagers have enough money to go necking in cars and drive out to movies. That's quite a society. It's almost as if all of the 50s are here in a box.
I can't see anybody in any of the other cars.
I see. I see
something. That station right there.
There's some folks. There's somebody there. Those guys are down below view. Hard to know.
Who was the photographer?
O period, Winston Link. Yeah.
Being a car guy, I'm looking at that and going, okay, the train is the old technology.
Yeah.
The cars are current technology
Yep.
and amazing.
Yep.
And you're looking at the future
Yep.
jet. Now remember, if you look at the cars in the mid-50s, they were all trying to emulate.
Great point. Great point.
Yeah.
Great point.
And nobody's trying to emulate a locomotive.
Right, and you're picking up on something right there that, that you got to earlier. In the same way that machines and machines have contact, aesthetics and aesthetics start hitting each other. So jet plane aesthetics and automobile aesthetics start echoing one another. These kinds of echo processes are what give us our visual environment. And that's a really interesting thing to be alert to. Yeah, I had one other thought about this. It has escaped me. It may come back. Pardon?
What are cars emulating now then?
Wait, what are cars emulating now? Oh boy, I think I have an answer to some of that. I think one thing cars are emulating right now is Mac computers. I actually think computers have set the design agenda in our own time. Do you remember when the Apple computer went all plastic? Do you remember the phase where they went all plastic? Suddenly that sort of semi-lucite kind of plastic was everywhere. I think, and this brings us to an issue that we haven't touched on really yet, except briefly on the colonialism area, which is power. Who's not in that picture?
I was just going to say, on your computer and cars, there was a story in the paper yesterday about the 3 most popular paint colors for cars and trucks.
What are they?
White, silver, and black.
Oh my God! Oh, that's great. I love it.
And immediately you think of
White, silver, and black right here in my pocket, man. I am so powerful. I love
The
this.
author actually mentioned that 1956.
1956. All right, 1956 for O. Winston Link. Great, thanks. That's great. Okay, but let's think about power for a minute. Let's think about social power. In the same, I love the connection to the computer in our own time, and I think that's a good connection. Who is not in that picture? Mom, dad, old folks. Who else?
Kids.
Well, young kids. Yeah, these guys haven't quite completed the mating ritual. Eventually. It's not a family situation yet. That's right.
Pets.
Pets? No pets. 1956 is 1 year after what? Rosa Parks, Birmingham, civil rights. Ladies and gentlemen, there are no it's all white. There are no African Americans in this image at all. And in fact, when I'm doing this off the top of my head, but when I scan back through my memory of images of automobiles in this period, they very rarely include African Americans. They include a few Mexican American lowrider fans, but I don't associate automobiles in this period with African Americans.
But no advertisement on TV. You didn't see blacks doing any kind of advertisement.
That's not true. In fact, you did see African Americans all the time doing advertisements, mostly for people like Harry Belafonte or Sammy Davis Jr. a little bit later, or Robeson, Paul Robeson. Were all very active African Americans.
I wasn't living in this country.
Okay, so yeah, no, it's okay, but they were there, but they weren't associated with cars. I'm sorry, did I hear a comment there?
Well, I was just thinking, basically, there's 2 people in that picture that you can really delineate as being white.
Fair.
You have no idea, or at least I don't, looking at the picture, who's in those other cars.
Sure, right. So
but I would agree with your premise that there isn't a lot of diversity in photographs in that area.
Right. And what I want to flag with that, I mean, maybe this is just a little narrow example, but what I want to flag with that is that a dominant technology, a technology like an automobile or now like a computer, tends to get associated in its moment with the communities that are also themselves dominant. And if race is a criterion for dominance in a particular period, the machines are going to be configured in part by that cultural criterion. And I think that's really interesting. So an intriguing story here is the cell phone. Cell phone in our time, I would argue, is a ubiquitous device. Many folks use it. Apple is pretty good at having multiracial advertisements, though they're all young folks. What you don't see is that the cell phone is becoming a dominant technology in Africa. You just don't see that. It's culturally uncool. If this were the dominant technology in France, we'd all be using cell phones and drinking wine. And it would feel very sophisticated, right? When we go to le cell phone shop, okay? But it's dominant in African countries, not so much, yeah.
I'd like to argue that point.
Great.
It's very difficult to wire Africa.
Yep.
So the phones that they do have are cell phones.
I totally agree. But what I'm actually after a different element. I agree with that. The element that I'm after is, given the success of cell phones in Africa, we might expect to see the kinds of depictions of Africans using cell phones that we do routinely see, for example, of Japanese. But we don't. And I'm kind of going back to why not. Joe?
On a trip to China, I went to a lot of places in rural China where cell phones and satellite dishes were all over the place.
Right.
Hardly any cars, any mechanical ways of traveling, but satellites and cell phones.
Right.
But now China is trying to develop its own car culture, its own car industry.
Yep. And this, I think, is a challenge for cultural historians. How do you disembed automobiles and other dominant technologies from dominant cultural frames in which they may be depicted? How do we recover the history of lowriders, for example? I love lowriders. I don't know, how many of you, this is a car, you guys do lowriders? Oh, all right, good. I don't know. All right, so lowriders, fascinating. Mexican-American mostly. Come with a whole musical sound script, a set of styles, unbelievably beautiful upholstery. They hop. My promise to myself was that when I got tenure at Stanford, I would get a lowrider and hop it down Palm Drive. I have not yet done that, but it's still very much on the agenda. There's a little discussion with my sweetheart about whether or not we can afford a lowrider and where I'd keep it if we did. But the Impala, I want the lowrider Impala that goes pop, pop, pop. My point here is that we need to recover the history of the lowrider alongside the history of the Chevy Bel Air. And those histories are entwined. But one reason that the history of the lowrider is hard to get at is because it's even less culturally legitimate in our time than the cultural history of the Bel Air.
Religion.
Oh, boy. OK. So this is a mega church. And that's Joel Osteen. You may recognize Joel Osteen, the minister. I am a huge fan of late night religion. This is great. Some things I confess to, and there's like nobody bats an eye, right? And then other things like, you what? All right. So when Jimmy Swaggart ruled the airwaves, I stayed up every night for him. And now that Joel Osteen's out there, I stay up for him too. I also, when I go to carnivals, what I really like to watch are the knife salesmen. I am a fan of beautiful rhetoric, and I'm a fan of great preaching. In any event, this church is fascinating to me. It's fascinating to me because the type of church that it is, the mega church, emerges right alongside, you guessed it, the automobile, the ubiquity of the automobile. Depending on whose history you tell, the kind of church that Joel Osteen is in emerges out of the Jesus freak movement in the 1960s, the sudden mobility of folks then. There's another history that one of my former students has written, professor now at NYU, which says that in fact, the first megachurch in America emerges in Orange County. It's called the Crystal Cathedral, and it emerges out of, ready for this, a drive-in movie theater. The first services he holds are in a drive-in movie theater. Okay, and this is Robert Schuller, thank you, to whom my grandmother gave money every week for his hour of power. I don't give money to my late night preachers, I just watch them and feel close to them. My point here is that the story of American religion would not be the same without the automobile. But until my student's book is out, there is no history of American religion that I know of that takes the experience of automobility into account. So one of her chapters, absolutely brilliant, compares three things. The movie screen before which Robert Schuller stood when he preached, the windshield through which people looked to see that, and their experience, imaginative at the time, of God above, seeing God through the service. What does it mean to see God through windshields and screens? How does that connect back to the road stories that drove the American Puritans? Suddenly, we are now deep in American history, deep in American culture. We're way in, all of a sudden. Especially when we consider that Robert Schuller was a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church, which was the direct descendant of Calvin's church. And the first Puritans were, in fact, Calvinists. We are deep, 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 deep back in there now. OK. So a couple ways to handle this problem. A technological determinist would say, the advent of automobiles made it possible to bring so many people to the building and thus to have this kind of experience. Fine. Good story, a little short, but good. Someone like my student, Erica Robles at NYU, one of the most brilliant students I've ever had the privilege of working. Teaching her was like driving a really, really, really beautiful car. My whole mission was don't crash the car. Just say, here's the road and get out of the way. So what Erica would say is that, in fact, the experience of congregation is entirely different because of your experience of the practice of automobility. Because you're driving a car and experience yourself as intimately connected to the people in the car, but also loosely connected to the people around you in their other cars, you have an entirely different vision of what it means to be in congregation. In the same way that the Pilgrims had an understanding of what it meant to be a community based on their time together on ships and then in these little walled settlements in Massachusetts, we now have an experience of congregation, of community before God, built around an experience of automobility. So another imaginary exam question. You're looking at this image. You see Joel Osteen. This is actually in the Houston, I believe it's the Houston Astrodome is where he preaches. It's a Houston ballpark. I think it's called the Astrodome. Yeah. So he's there. If I gave you a test question and said, what about automobiles do you see here? What do you see? How are automobiles shaping religious practice based on this image?
Massively.
Massively, OK. Walk me through it.
Well, Julian, it's 17,000 people.
OK, so first off, automobiles get everybody there.
I was going to say, you have 17,000 people basically coming in a different vehicle,
yep,
of different years, different stages, different everything, diverse vehicles with diverse populations.
OK, that's great. Diverse vehicles, diverse populations. Let me go even further and say that the vehicles pre-individuate the congregants. They literally make you already sort of come as you are. You've heard that expression, particularly in Joel Osteen's kind of church. You come as you are because you're already as you are in your car. It's a little bit like that drive-in thing again. You drive in together in the car, but you're not with the congregation. It's not like the community walking to church as it would have been in Puritan America. It's the community coming in individual pods to come together, and now to witness the service as individual pods turn toward a screen as they might in a drive-in. That's really, really fascinating to me. My student Erica has suggested in conversation, though not in her book, something that I wish she'd put in the book, and it says this. It says that learning to appreciate ministers on screens is done by learning to appreciate the world through a windshield. I think that's a really interesting idea, that we learn how to apprehend the world through screens, television, film, other places, and to appreciate its reality every time we drive a car and look through a windshield. It's a little extreme, that's why she doesn't want it in the book, but I find that to be a really provocative idea.
There is, Fred, a study of Windows, as in Microsoft Windows, screens, and indeed windshields.
Oh, great.
It's a cultural study, and it would lend force to your...
To that argument. Great, terrific, yeah. I just think that's a real possibility here. I think it's fascinating.
Well, it's about framing. Okay, it's about looking through things.
And also, I think this idea of pre-individuation is important. I think automobiles are enormously individuating. Yeah, question.
I would say it almost takes it one step deeper, where you're at home watching on your TV screen all that's going on. So it's like one more level. You're individuals in their living rooms watching, and then seeing as a group whatever was going on.
Well, that's another way to think about cars, right, is as a portable living room. And certainly a lot of designers have thought that way. Thinking about the car space, the rec room space as related, that's another set of cultural questions that would be really interesting to explore. Yeah?
Doesn't the screen almost take away from our individualism because it's forcing us to look at something in particular?
Okay.
But you can kind of almost see that when you like go like to say like a hockey game, and you're watching the game and the jumbotron is going on, and a lot of times you get drawn to the jumbotron instead of the game. You find yourself watching the jumbotron instead of the game. So you're not actually experiencing anything. You're just experiencing the screen.
So I'm guessing
you're so used to it that you just kind of draw to it.
I'm guessing you drive down the road and are occasionally riveted by a billboard. Bada bing. Oh, that felt good. Yeah. Yeah, me too. Me too. Yeah, me too. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm pushing the analogy just to sort of play with it, but I take your point. Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
Is this a unique American experience, or does this phenomenon occur in other parts of the world? I don't know.
Yeah. So I only know what my student tells me, which is that it's a dominant American phenomenon that occurs in some parts of the other world, but in some other parts of the world, but nowhere near in these proportions and these numbers. So Europe is not doing this. There are parts of Asia, parts of South America where this is happening, but not in Europe, for example.
Aren't some of these exporting?
Sorry, what?
Aren't some of these exporting? Because I think Schuler was international.
Oh, sure, absolutely. There are major efforts to export. Yeah. Schuler actually had an international television system, but actually was rather unsuccessful in establishing satellite churches. He actually maintained the central church in Orange County and broadcast from there, was relatively unable to establish satellite churches. Yeah?
I was going to say the only thing equal to this, to me, in Europe would be a Pope's appearance in the Vatican Plaza.
Right. And let's pause on that for a moment, right? So this kind of arrangement is a specifically non-Catholic arrangement. This is a Protestant arrangement.
Cars, where I don't think the majority of the people for the Vatican situation would be mobilized in cars.
Why not? Why wouldn't they be?
In trains, because and buses, that's important, and bikes.
And what's the center of the Catholic liturgy?
Pardon?
What's the center of the Catholic liturgy? What's the peak of the service?
Seeing the Pope.
Well, they're seeing the Pope, but getting the host.
Yeah.
Getting the host. You've got to be physically present to get the host, and you have an individual relationship with the church. Very difficult to get the host in the Houston Astrodome.
And that's not a community.
Right. It's not a community, and that's sort of my point, is that the automobile specifically supports non-communion communities. That's where I'm going with this. I'm trying to tie this into American Protestantism and argue that American Protestantism is shaping how we use the car, but the car is shaping how we experience God in American Protestantism. That's where I'm going with this. It's this coevolution of the two perspectives. And the key link is practice. Our practices in the automobile shape what our practices are in the church. Our practices in the church, our experiences there, shape what it means to be in the car. Okay.
Let's move it on.
All right, Michael, you're up on this one.
You just stick a quick note in. I should ask, time is moving on. Do you want to take a 5-minute break? No. Oh, right, you're fine with it. Okay, let's just keep going then. Let's keep going with it.
It's a brave crowd.
Industry is obviously a key component in understanding the car in the last 150 years. And we have all sorts of notions, again, of industry, the factory, production line, the relationship to technology, to research and development and such, employment, all the rest. But of course, given the perspective we're taking of just breaking down some of these categories, especially in terms of your kind of meta categories, Fred, representation, legitimacy, and practice, here, representations of industry and how we understand industry when we're not necessarily a part of it. And this is just a reminder of that it's Diego Rivera, an artist who, was here as a, let's say, he's taken a left-wing view of labor.
He's a commie.
Yeah, okay. Yes, no, fine.
Thanks.
But
I just want to get that cleared up.
Yeah, industry and labor and the labor movement, how it gets celebrated or not, and again, the practices that lie behind the infrastructures or whatever it is. So it was just a simple point to elaborate, really, on where we've been going with the previous stuff.
Yep. And I would add to that, so first of all, I actually think he was a really, really interesting guy. What I would elaborate on here is if you look at the two period styles, the 19th century, or maybe even older architecture, the designs, the faces, and then the mural, you'll notice that in the 19th century or earlier, the artwork, the labor is obscured. The mechanism by which the stone is cut is kind of hidden, and there's scroll work, and there's faces, and there's artwork, but it's artwork designed to be its own thing, not to reveal the hand of the cutter quite. The industrial image, by contrast, is all about revealing the innards of the industrial process. And this is something that also accompanies the rise of the automobile and the rise of mechanization in everyday life. The desire to reveal the innards of the machine and to appreciate the beauty of its structures.
And I think it's double-edged here. On the one hand, you have the alienation of labor and industry, but also particularly through car enthusiast communities, of lifting up the bonnet and engaging with maintenance, repair, restoration, keeping it running, and the profound humanity of that, the dignity of that, the working with machinery that takes us into all sorts of deep modern notions of non-alienated labor.
Right.
And that's what's coming across in here.
What is the Robert Pirsig book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance?
Yeah.
I'm willing to argue that this mural leads fairly directly to that. The other element I want to flag here is the element of social class. The old architecture there is very clearly the architecture of the wealthy. It's a wealthy person's design. Ordinary folks don't get to live under beautiful sculpture like that. The mural, on the other hand, features ordinary people acting under images of other ordinary Mexicans that are depicted almost as if they were gods. And so one of the things that Michael's pointing out is that machines, and cars in particular, are massive leveling devices. They level society, and then as we open them up and experience them as living machines, they allow us to experience ourselves in relation to large social systems quite differently than we might at other times.
That was quite good, though. That was excellent. How many of you, though, are sort of actively, with your cars, your car collection, or whatever, taken with the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance thing, which is that really to know a vehicle, and we talked in a previous lecture about the soul of a vehicle.
Wow,
engaging, really getting to know a vehicle through repair, working on it, maintaining it. It's very Heideggerian, this too. Heidegger's notion that we really know stuff in the way it fails, and we have to handle it, care for it, look after it. How many of you, is that what is at the heart of your relationship with the vehicle, working on it? It must be many people. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't work on my vehicle, on my car, but I feel the need to wash it personally from time to time, so that I know every scratch and thing that's on there, and so I know what's new and if I can improve my driving style somewhere. I feel like I owe it to the car almost, to take care of it once in a while. I get it washed in the regular sort of car washes and all that, but every once in a while I need to wash it myself.
Yes.
Well, I mean, with the increased technology that goes into a car, and I know we've talked about this a bit before, like that era of the grease monkey repair of your own vehicle is starting to be a thing of the past generation, and how does a cultural historian lift that up, right? Like there's a certain amount of when that goes away and you're the alien lands on the planet and sees we have highly specified people that take care of the cars, that understand what's under all the plastic panels, and the rest of us are just the operator of the pushing the button, where it's much more technology and not so much motoring.
So I see that as a species of power shift, and a shift away from the opening out of the innards of the machine and the leveling of that to the black boxing of the machine and the restoration of the power of builders and the mechanics as against ordinary folks.
But those of us that miss that are what we now call collectors. You go back to the 50s and 60s cars. You go back to the muscle cars of the 50s and 60s where you can get in there.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
So
no, I still I think that for a lot of people that an automobile still remains as in the same category as a pet.
Oh, interesting. Why would you categorize it like a pet? That's really interesting.
Gives you love back, or gives you something back for the time that you took. You nurture it, you care for it, you take care of it. Or you notice something should be done, maybe you don't do it yourself, and then you take care of this object, which is like your pet, and the pet takes care of you.
Okay, this is really interesting. So there's a whole lot of work on robots right now that actually makes exactly this case. That robots, we used to fear that robots would take us over by telling us what to do. On the contrary, recent research suggests that robots will take us over by asking us to take care of them. Sherry Turkle at MIT has been doing this work. Turkle, T-U-R-K-L-E. I think it's K-L-E, maybe K-E-L. Anyways, there are apparently a lot of robots right now, robot pets in old folks' homes, and old folks are taking care of their robot pets as their task. Yeah?
In the 1960s, the movies The Umbrella of Cherbourg came out, and that was about the social class situation of a mechanic versus a female of a different category.
Right. Well, another element of machines that we haven't talked about is gender. I mean, you know, I am noticing that most of us in the room tonight are male. I'm definitely aware that most of the I could come out of my mouth as guys. Everybody I knew who worked on cars growing up was a guy, and it was a guy bonding space. We could do stuff together around cars that would have been hard to do in other parts of our lives. I find that interesting. I mean, I think it's interesting that, you know, machines are in some sense centers of certain kinds of intimacy that can be hard to have in other parts of your world. That's interesting. Yeah.
Let's move on.
Because
the other side of industry, of course.
Dang.
The scale of the auto industry over the last century. And some of the figures we were getting last week from Joe, you know, how pervasive still the industry is. But one of the, well, you know, it's the centrality, simple point, how central to, you know, warfare in the 20th century vehicles were.
So we've talked about representation in practice. There's another thing that cultural historians do, and I don't have a name for it, so I'll make one up right now, but I know I do it for a living, and so do my students and my colleagues. They tend to look at particular objects as axles and ask what wheels turn around that axle, what spokes come off this thing, what can we see that connects to this thing, what does this thing illuminate for us. So this thing illuminates a set of institutional connections that are very powerful, and Michael's kind of summed them up nicely there. The techno-military industrial entertainment complex. Automobiles, but other technologies too, mostly having to do with weaponry, are at the center of a series of technological institutions. So another way to do cultural history is to say, what institutions does this device link? Now, I love to do that with computers, right? If I pull my computer out of my pocket, I can say, what institutions does this link? Help me, anybody.
Ask Siri and see what she says.
That is an excellent point. I could ask Siri. Siri yeah, ask Siri. Siri's well, we're not going to say that word. In any event, well, so a couple of things that it links. First off, Apple Computer is, you know, a corporation. It links the companies that brought us the metal and the glass and the coltan inside. It links us to the mines of Africa where the coltan was mined. It links us to the factories of China where the wires and the circuit boards are stripped and the items repurposed. Also links us back to the military where particular kinds of software, cybernetic visions, information theory were in fact developed, Bell Labs notwithstanding. Okay, when we look at an automobile, particularly a Jeep, we can ask, what worlds does this link us back to, and how might we interrogate them through this device? So again, the exercise. If we see this device, we have a Jeep in our backyard, what can we say about the military world that brought it into being?
You mean like the Korean War or World War II, or what?
Great question. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is specify the historical moment, and the machine will do that for us. So this machine is probably Korean era, I'm guessing?
Yeah, it is.
You guys, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So this would take us right into the Korean War. But let's go a little more forward. Let's go to a Hummer, right? You have a Hummer, a Humvee, that has video in the back. What is the It's a commercially produced Humvee. What does a Humvee connect you to? War in Iraq. Pardon? A tank. What else? What's the video doing in there? passenger video? Well, you know where passenger video comes from? Yeah. Well, so passenger video comes from a number of places, but one of the places it comes from is tanks. You know, if you don't want to be looking out an open slot into a weapon space where you might get flame or other weapon material through the slot, you close up the tank real tight and you put a camera up there and you watch the video screen. Okay? Boy, that's if you've had thoughts about tanks and video screens and you enter a Hummer with videos on the back, it's terrifying. So again, looking at the practice dimension of entering these automobiles, you can see links between different institutions in different moments, and the migration of particular kinds of practices from a military-industrial space to an entertainment space out into our everyday lives and back again. These chains of linkage, these chains of association are what culture is made of. Tracing them is what cultural historians do.
We could go into that with the entertainment side of it, because you pulled out the video component. And of course, it goes so deeply now into the gaming industry and simulation.
Yep.
And so air simulation, car simulation games were absolutely seriously sponsored, let's say, by the military for training, but also for remote operations.
Right, right. And you know, different branches of the service currently track really young gamers, are trying to attract young gamers because they have skill sets by playing these games that make them valuable for new drone-based modes of warfighting.
One discussion we're having through Revs, because we're very much focused on the future of the past of the automobile, through archival practices, building up an archive of photos, of memorabilia, but also cars themselves, so it's the future of the museum. And a key point in the future of old cars is we cannot keep driving them. 100 years' time, you could, to have an original vehicle that's going to wear out. So a question could be, well, okay, so you maintain it, you replace the worn-out bits with new bits. But then it's no longer old and original and authentic anymore, or is it? So an option would be, okay, let's figure out the key components of driving an old vehicle and the vehicle itself, and simulate it, so that we will not lose the old experiences of driving, but be able to perpetuate.
Right.
So it's seriously asking, okay, can we pause the experience of driving a 50s Chevy or a Korean War Jeep, and then reproduce that, replicate that in a simulated environment?
Right.
This is precisely what the military have been doing with warfare. And of course, we see so many of the effects of that around us now. So the world of the museum and the future of the archive connected to military simulation. Absolutely the same.
Very powerful.
And it's an intriguing thing. And
can I ask just briefly, of the collectors in the room, or folks who really care about authenticity in automobiles, and particularly the people who answered yes, if you replace a part with a modern one, it destroys the authenticity of the automobile. What is authenticity and why does it matter in regard to cars?
It's history.
Okay, hit more words, please.
That's what it was.
Okay.
Exactly what it was.
So it's
I've got old cars, new motors,
okay,
and I've got muscle cars that are completely original.
Okay. And so the
And they're completely different. I mean, the old cars are hot rods. They do one thing, and the muscle cars are representative of the narrative.
Okay.
And that's exactly what the companies were making at that point.
So if I'm just going to translate this, it sounds like what attracts you to the authenticity then is the quiddity of it, the thingness of it, like it's that thing from that moment. Is it also the historian's thing, which I get into in a deep way, of having something from a real past period and being able to touch the period as a whole through that thing, or is it more just the thing is itself what it is?
Part of that is, I mean, that's the car that you wanted to own. At the time you were,
that's
a teenager.
Boy, do I know this.
That's what I want.
Right, and now you have it.
That's what I want.
Right.
And if you change it, it isn't what you want.
So part of that's really interesting. Did everybody hear that? It was the car you wanted, but if you change it, it won't be anymore. What's intriguing to me there is the entanglement of authenticity with desire. Right. That's really interesting. That's For cultural historians, that's just rid me. I want to hear from folks I haven't heard from quite as much. Did I hear from you in the back? Were you? Oh, you're just scratching. Okay, great.
I just wanted to add that I've noticed that culturally there have been, in the last 10 years or so, there have been fragmentations of subcultures within this whole old car community. One at the extreme end is absolutely as it was built, original from the factory, all the way to resto mod, which means it kind of looks like it has the sheet metal up, but really there's nothing
original about it. That's really interesting.
So there's all these subcategories of groups.
Yeah.
You know, that have fragmented.
Sort of a spectrum of authenticity-ness. Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
One of the things I want to mention is going back to one of the attractions for tourism is archaeology. Pulling a car out of a barn that's been there, it's actually more valuable than somebody who takes something and restores it. So now people are recognizing that that's only new once and that it's in its original state. The Mullen Museum has that old Bugatti that was sunk into the lake, and that's their biggest attraction, not the Atlantic, not the other.
Fascinating.
It's the car pulled out of the lake. It's the car pulled out of the barn.
This was actually in the New York Times a couple of days ago. There's yesterday, day before yesterday, the 8th, there was Bonham's auction of preserved cars at Fred Simeone's museum in Philadelphia. And it was all precisely about this kind of car and their rising prices. Yeah, stuff that is unrestored and therefore of its time.
If you go into the museum, you see artifacts from a long time ago. They're not probably look like that when they're old.
Yeah. Joe?
You were talking earlier about cars being plebeian and legitimacy. And one of the things that we're talking about here is that these collector cars are moving into the realm of collector art, like masterpieces from the Renaissance. It used to be that old cars were just not of interest to other than a very, very small select group. It's become much, much broader.
So there's a certain, I'm going to translate it, so there's a certain market value then to preserving the authenticity in the same way that an unrestored painting or an unrestored piece of furniture in some ways has more value than something restored or changed over time.
Oh, absolutely. That was the argument actually that was being shared in the New York Times, that cars are moving this way. You would never strip the varnish off an 18th century Chippendale chair and paint it with the latest color. You would never do that. It would kill the value, it would kill everything about the artifact. So why are you doing it with cars?
Great. Thank you. Yes, in the blue.
And that's what's cool to me, like you were saying, when you look at the old unrestored cars, you see them falling apart, you see seats open with the horsehair stuffing in it, and you see the different materials that were used back then and the ways of assembling and that kind of thing that at that time were cutting edge technology. And you didn't see the evolution of it. You look at different periods and you see the kind of a hallmark of where the design at that point was Art Deco, which was really futuristic, that gets incorporated in the car. In the 50s you have the space, in the 60s the whole space.
And we've now hit the question that is at the heart of all cultural history and archaeology. It's actually at the heart of Michael's research, and I'm guessing he's been far too modest to tell you about this, but I'll tell you about it since you're sitting there. And the question there is, how do we know what we know about the past? Now, I'm a historian. I gave my job talk here at Stanford 10 years ago. I'll never forget it. It was the most terrifying day of my life. And a very senior scholar, who is now my next door neighbor, we're very friendly, was really mean to me. He really didn't want me here. Didn't like the area I was in. He says to me, historically, but how do you know? But how do you know? But how do you know? You're making all these claims about the past, but how do you know? And so the question of how we know is entirely entwined with this question of authenticity. Do we know through our hands? Do we know the horsehair? Do we know the windshield screen? Do we know from sitting in the box and feeling what it's like to be in the box of the automobile and not out on the street? Or, what would an archaeology of the automobile be like? What does authenticity mean? Or are we, you and I have had other conversations about other archaeological things where we talk about the power of representation. What systems of representation make the past accessible? What systems of representation make it inaccessible? What's knowable? What's not? I think that's a final body of questions that remains around the automobile that's really interesting, that collectors are already right smack in the middle of all the time. but guys like me are trying to figure it out. I mean, I want to know what it means to know the past.
How do you preserve the past, though? Because over time, the car is going to get older and older. It's
let me get even
painting that people go back and they look at, you know, it takes forever to restore a painting by, you know, Da Vinci.
So there's another fantasy hiding in here. It's the fantasy of stopping or reversing time. And that's a historian's fantasy, too. I share that fantasy all the time. I'm forever listening to 1960s records, but I don't know how to do that. Did you have a question or a comment in the back?
I just was saying, you never use your car, because it's no longer a car.
Right. If it becomes a collector's item, you never use it. It's like the chair you never sit in that you know is the antique. Right. 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 And this is one of the paradoxes, right? You know, was it Faulkner who said, you know, what is it? The past is, what did he say? The past isn't even the past. He said, the past isn't behind us. It isn't even the past. Something like that. I forget. I'm sorry. I'm losing track. But the point is that to know a thing is to change a thing. And that's hard, because you want also not to change it. You want to know it. And then it's a paradox. And one of the things that's interesting to me about cars is, how are we going to know what they were? What does it mean to do we have to drive them? Miles Collier believes you got to drive them. Okay. If I drive them in Naples, will I have a sufficient feeling of what it was like to have driven them in Paris in the 19th? Yeah, exactly. I don't think so. But right, yeah, exactly. I don't think so. Exactly. But some folks seem to think that that's actually sort of kind of plausible. If we have a simulation, is that enough? I kind of don't know. And
if you've actually driven it, you've actually felt it.
And
you can then get in a rental car and drive the same roads out of
it's a different universe.
And imagine, yeah, it's going to feel very different. But if you then go and sit in the Grand Prix Mercedes, in Mars's Grand Prix Mercedes, you will, you know, you need to drive it. They're not a static thing. To experience it, you have to drive. But you don't have to be right in that context. You just need to bring plenty of imagination to it.
And so this is what I think of as the, you know, almost a mathematical theory of history. It's like whatever that line is. I forget what it's called. Where the asymptote. No, it's the line that you never quite get to the bottom of the graph. The asymptote. It is the asymptote. Thank you. It's been a long time. You know, it's the asymptote theory of history. You get closer and closer to the past, but you never quite get there. But getting closer and closer sure is a lot of fun. I think we're through our time.
That's pretty much it. So we could just keep going.
Question? One more question, and then we'll break.
But, yes.
Reproduce that adequately?
Well, so some historians think that it does. I think that it doesn't. I think that the world we know through film is a lot less. Is even less knowable than the way that we know what's beside the road when we look out the window. I actually think that film is highly constructed, highly constricted, highly generic, and not very good at making the past visible. And you're talking to somebody who spent decades writing about film and history. So I've really grown to distrust it. A couple more questions, and then we really got to wrap.
We have the technology to reproduce things the way they were.
Okay.
So you can produce a 1950s Chevy engine the way it was if you wanted to.
Okay.
And wouldn't that be more real than a simulation?
Don't know.
Nice. Try that with Steve.
We did some research in NASA.
Steve,
bandwidth human is 720 megabits a second. So, and we can do that now with networking. Wow. If we actually figure out how to do film at that data rate,
That's a great.
That would be a technology that would make
dude, don't go to Mars. Focus on that. Thank you all very much for a lovely conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Great.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.